Good morning. We're waiting on slides, but we can kick this off without slides. Huh? They were sent a week and a half ago.
Okay, a week and a half?
Yeah.
I'll look.
Yeah. We're going to have a very interesting discussion today. I don't know if any of you have looked ahead to 1 Corinthians 7. It talks significantly about divorce and remarriage. So in light of that, let's go to our Father in prayer. Our Father in heaven, we thank you for the many blessings you've given us, for the opportunity to come together and study from your word. Father, for the beautiful day that we have, for the day that we have that we're not promised. Father, we're so thankful of all the blessings that you've given us, but most of all for your Son, Jesus Christ, that gives us a hope of eternal life with you. Father, be with us as we dive into your word and study closely, that the things that we learn may be applied to our daily lives, and that we may show the face of Jesus Christ to others. It's in his holy name we pray. Amen. There we go. All right. What's the one overarching issue that the Corinthians have? One overarching issue, and it's throughout the book. Come on. It hadn't been that long, guys. What?
Said they were straying.
They were straying. But what is it that we see throughout the book that we've seen every single time? Are they united? Oh, no, they're divided. They're divided. They find everything to be divided about. They get divided about who converted them, who preached to them, who baptized them. They get divided about what's some of the other stuff. Later on, we'll study about, they get divided about their spiritual gifts. They get divided about everything. And throughout 1 Corinthians, it's a matter of division because they're taking a number of things and going in completely opposite directions. Today is no different. As you may remember, 2 weeks ago, we wrapped up, I'm trying to get there, hang on. We wrapped up with what I thought was kind of, we went through that. Church discipline, do not sue the brethren. Remember this one? The saying at this point in time was because at this time there was a saying. They were saved. And because of that, they felt that all things are lawful. Everything goes. Because I have fallen under grace, therefore, since I am under grace, I can do whatever I want to do because the blood of Christ covers me under grace. And remember, we went back to Romans where he says, what shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? Absolutely not. And so he kind of has that same discussion here. But that carries on because we talked about that, but then immediately after there was a discussion about sexual immorality, right? All things are lawful for me. And he talks about being joined to a prostitute and how you shouldn't do that. Sexual immorality is one of those things that is going to be a problem. Well, I have an issue with the guys that put the chapters and verses in here because they put chapter 7 right in the middle of a thought. Because the end of chapter 6 is, all things are lawful, but not all things are profitable. Meaning there's a segment of people that believe they can do whatever they want to because they fall under grace. Chapter 7 begins with, in order to avoid sexual immorality, he starts off with the other side of the coin. It is good for a man not to touch a woman. How many of you are married in here? How many of you guys are married? Paul said it. Paul said it. Is that what Paul's saying? Is it good for a man not to touch a woman? It'd be easy to take this out of context. But remember, the Corinthians are divided. So on the one hand, they're covered by grace. All things are lawful. Not all things are profitable. On the other hand, and there's actually a number of translators that put this in quotation marks. Now concerning, it is good for a man not to touch a woman, quotation marks. Because this is probably another slogan that they use. So you had on the one side, I can do whatever I want. You have on the other side that people that were married were abstaining from sexual relationships. Paul's going to kind of talk them through that here. All things are lawful. So you got on that side, you've got the indulgence side. I can do whatever I want to do. And then you have the self-denial side. You've heard the word, I'm sure you've heard the word. It's a word we use every day. Asceticism. Asceticism, self-denial. It's basically, you have some of that now in the Catholic Church, for instance, where the priest or the monks kind of set themselves aside and abstain from those kind of worldly pleasures, if you will. So they've taken a similar stance as the Corinthians, or at least this segment of the Corinthians. It is good for a man not to touch a woman. And Paul's going to go into a number of discussions here about that's not necessarily so. Now, concerning the things of which you wrote. So remember, 1 Corinthians is divided into two segments. The first 6 chapters are those things that Paul had heard about. Said, listen, I've heard these things from people that have been traveling through Ephesus at the time of the writing, and people that have come to me, and they're telling me these things, and we need to address them. And so the first 6 chapters that we've gone through are the things that Paul had heard. Chapter 7, he says, okay, now let's get to the things that you're asking about. So obviously there was a letter from the Corinthians to Paul, or some kind of discussion from the Corinthians to Paul to say, we have questions. And this is one of those questions. Bear with me. Let each man have his own wife. Let the husband render to his wife the affection due her. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Okay, husbands, you with me so far? Yep, I'm good there. Yep. Remember, wife, I've got authority. What does he say in the next sentence? Let each woman have her own husband, and likewise also the wife to her husband. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Thought you have so far on this. I don't want to get too far before we get into some discussion so far. Thank you, Keith. I appreciate that. What does that mean? The wife does not, or the wife does not have authority over her own body, and neither does the husband have authority over his own body. What does that mean? Do I? You submit to one another. Those of you who have been married a long time, I, by the way, have been married for 43 years to the same woman. Just want to make that clear. Those of you who have been married a long time, if you've been married a while, you've kind of figured this out, because if you haven't figured this out, you're probably not married. Right? I hate to ask those questions, but if you've been married a while, you figured out that this is a joint effort. This is not, my way or the highway, because more often than not, in that case, it's the highway. Do not deprive one another. Do not deprive one another. Except by mutual consent. So the only time that you can abstain, I guess, is when you both agree, yeah, we're gonna hold off for prayer, for worship, for meditation. But do not deprive one another. Thoughts that you have before we move on? Too big a crowd today. Concession, not command. I do want to be clear here. Paul says this is advice. This is advice from me. This is not a command from God. This is my advice. Here's what you need to do. Because on the one hand, you have those that are going out and visiting prostitutes, and on the other hand, you have husbands and wives that are abstaining altogether. And this becomes a problem, because what does that lead to? If you're a married man or a married woman, and you're not showing the due affection to your spouse, what's the obvious downside of that? Do what?
Go somewhere else and do it.
They will go somewhere else, or at least be tempted to go elsewhere. At least be tempted. And that's what Paul says, except for because of sexual immorality. You need to have your own husband or your own wife, because quite frankly, I don't think you guys can keep it together if you don't. If it becomes a problem for you, instead of committing sexual immorality, you need to get married. That's what Paul says. Now, again, he says that from the standpoint of this is advice, this is not a command from God. God does not command you to get married. Paul later on says, I wish everybody could be like me, because apparently Paul had no desire to be married. But not everybody can be like Paul. It says, remain single if you can, marry if you have to, but it's better to marry than to burn. Better to marry than to burn with lust or with passion. Better to marry than to burn. So this is how important this is. Now we're going to get into the fun stuff. In verses 10 through 16, he talks about marriage to unbelievers. Now remember, the Corinthians, fairly new converts. Paul had spent roughly 18 months with them. So it was likely in this case that even prior to coming to Christ, you would have folks that had come to Christ and were therefore believers, but they were married to those folks that didn't believe. As married couples, you guys ever disagree on things? I am familiar with at least one household whose husband is a Dallas Cowboys fan and whose wife is a Philadelphia Eagles fan. You cannot get a bigger divide than that. But, you know, PJ's a little misguided. But here Paul says, If you're married to an unbeliever, is that a reason to divorce? No. What's the only reason to divorce? Infidelity, adultery. What does he say? He says, if you're married to an unbeliever and they will stay with you, so apparently there were some pretty significant discussions going on here. I'm a believer, you're not. And they will stay with you, then don't seek to get a divorce. Stay together. Why should you stay together with an unbeliever? That's right. Who knows whether you can influence your husband or wife, your spouse? And how are you to influence them? Nag them? No. You don't nag them every day? Why don't you go to church with me? You never go anywhere with me. What do? You set an example. That's exactly right. You set an example. If you're the male in the relationship, who's the leader of the family? Yes. I hope you said that with authority and not with just a question. You make us look bad when you say, the man? Yeah, he said the man. Guys, you have to be the spiritual leader in your family. You have to be the leader in your family, most of all, the spiritual leader in your family. And this doesn't mean you lead with an iron fist. Because remember, let's go back to it's a joint effort. And this works the same way for wives if the wife is a believer and the husband's not. It's a joint effort. And when you bring the gospel message into that relationship, it ought to change lives. And it ought to change marriages. And if you have a believing spouse and an unbelieving spouse, that believing spouse ought to be changing the life of the unbelieving spouse. Jimmy?
I think that growing up, not just growing up, but both when Erica and I was first married, she was an influence on me because I wasn't going to church. I wasn't a believer. And I don't think it was her alone. It took the church community, the body of believers that had to continue to encourage her to keep coming. Because she could have easily said, hey, threw in the towel and said, hey, look, he's not going, I'm not going to go. So. And
it's, also be not yoked to unbelievers. A lot of times we walk into these relationships with our eyes wide open. Well, I'll change him, her. Sometimes that works. And I don't know the percentages, but I would guess it's probably about 50-50. Sometimes you have a great success story where the one spouse brings the other to Christ. And I've seen some folks that have come to Christ through that situation that were the strongest Christians that they became elders, they became deacons, they became Bible class teachers. They studied to the nth degree. But on the other hand, I've seen a number of situations where it's gone the other way, where a believer marries the unbeliever and now the believer no longer attends. The believer no longer has fellowship. So it works both ways. You kind of take your chances. Erica?
In no way do I take credit for Jimmy. But the reason I say that is because it wasn't that there was me not going anymore. It's just that I wanted to be that person where you need to come to worship service. But I was told, keep your mouth shut and just be an example. That was the hardest thing for me to do, to be an example and just to keep going. And
to be a quiet example.
A quiet example, and I did. I just took Cameron every Lord's Day and just went to worship service, and God did the work behind the scenes. I didn't even see any of that happening. I won't go into details, but I just listened to God, and because there were women in the church who knew better than me, I was young and married, and I was listening to their advice because I knew it was godly and spiritual, then I just let
See,
it
that's
go.
the other thing is we got, so to your point, in that situation, it's ever more important that you come to church because you're getting support, you're getting advice, you're getting, how do I work with an unbelieving husband and bring him to the truth? And you probably have people in the congregation that have dealt with similar issues. And folks, if you've dealt with similar issues, do not underestimate your impact on others. Because if you've dealt with those things, you can be such a blessing to those people who are currently dealing with those things. Don't just sit there. If you have these experiences and tough experiences, don't just sit there and be quiet. Because you've gone through those things for a reason. And you need to share those experiences with others. That's part of what being a believer is. Can I tell the story of your parents' conversion? Okay. I'll use an example. PJ's parents, I think, is a perfect example. Similar situation. So they were married before, and one came from a Catholic background, one came from Episcopalian. And they started studying, or actually, their neighbors started studying with PJ's mom. And PJ's mom came to believe. And PJ's mom started teaching the children. PJ's dad, who was Catholic, said, no, this can't be right. And I'm going to study up. And I think PJ ended up going to catechism class, and all the kids went to catechism class because Dad was, a Catholic. And although he wasn't a faithful Catholic at the time. Well, that's what I meant, yeah. Her mom was converted to the church, and he became a very faithful Catholic. But in the process, he was studying very hard. And you know what happened? As he studied and studied, he was converted. And he became probably one of the most influential men in that part of the country that I know of. He would preach, he would teach Bible class, he was extremely versed in Scripture. But who knows? Sure.
His Catholic parents and sister and all of their children eventually ended up being converted.
Do you hear that? He also converted his parents, who were Catholic, and his sister and all of their children. Who knows? It's important that you, as a believing spouse, have that influence on your unbelieving spouse. You become one flesh. And that means you need to be of a similar mind. Thoughts that you have? Yes, ma'am.
Some may know and some may not know. I had that similar situation where I was part of another church and I was married and I knew it wasn't right and I started studying and my neighbor introduced me to the church and I left and my ex-husband, he divorced me because of that. But I'm thankful for Brunette. She had a ladies' Bible study and I would go faithfully and I stuck in there and now I'm with who I'm supposed to be with. So,
And you can share your story with others who are going through somewhat similar circumstances. And that's the beauty of the church. That's the beauty of the congregation. Yes, Shirley?
My experience was just backwards. The children obeyed first because of Vacation Bible School.
Oh, wow.
And we were teaching Mom. Mom became a Christian. She was teaching her mother and her two sisters. They all became Christians. My dad became a Christian. So you never know.
I know. There tends to be a broad circle of influence that you may or may not realize you have. And especially when it's a close-knit circle of influence like family, you ought to be using it. Because how devastating, and again, there'll be no tears in heaven, but to get to heaven and realize that half your family's not there. That's the way I kind of look at it. Other thoughts you have? All right. Husband is not to divorce his wife. Unbelieving wife sanctified by the husband. Same thing. Spouse is the most likely opportunity to save the other spouse, and by extension, children, family, others. This is where it starts to get a little bit messy. Because Paul says, come as you are called. Live as you are called. So, says, if you are circumcised, stay that way, although I'm not sure how you undo that. But if you're circumcised, stay that way. If you're uncircumcised, stay that way. None of that matters. It goes, if you are a slave, you can get your freedom, fine. If not, stay a slave. That's fine too. Live as you are called. If you're free, don't become a slave except to Christ. Because you were already bought at a price. We are, collectively we, are all slaves, or should be slaves. And if we're not slaves, then we have a bigger problem. We all should be slaves to Christ. We have been bought as slaves to Christ. It's a decision we make willingly. We are bondservants. So when we get to the point where we start thinking, well, what's our definition of sin? My definition of sin. Let's be clear. Anything that puts us above God. When it becomes our choice versus God's choice, that's sin. We are bought at a price and we are slaves to Christ. So when it becomes, if you're a slave, do you get a say in the matter? Probably not. If you're a slave, who is your master? And it's what the master says that goes. Every time. And our master is Jesus Christ. So when it becomes a question of, well, am I going to do what I want to do, or am I going to do what the Bible says? Think of it in terms of that slave-master relationship. What happens to those slaves that do what they want to do, that don't obey their master? They get corrected, or worse. We are slaves to Jesus Christ. Thoughts that you have? You know, this is a very interesting subject, and you guys just aren't talking very much. Yes, sir.
You know, people sometimes get caught up in the weeds right here of the details of the specifics that Paul gives, but I think you hit the nail on the head. You know, the Corinthians were so gung-ho to make every division and every little nuance matter, right? I mean, who baptized you? What lineage did you come from? Were you married? Were you not? I mean, to them, it all seemed to matter, and they created this weird hierarchy that, you know, earthly things got crossed over into spiritual things, and you know, he could have written a whole book just outlining all the nuance that they had, and it doesn't really matter, because at the end of the day, what he's saying is all these distinctions are less than belonging to Christ, and whether that means you're married or you're single, whether that means you come from a Gentile background or a Jew background, you know, circumcised or not, and you know, we do the same. We come up with all these nuance, you know, specific, well, this versus this. And like you said, I mean, if we use the overarching litmus test, am I obedient and a slave to Jesus, and let that guide everything else, all the nuance kind of falls in place, you know, because that informs the decision. And, you know, so that's what was important to them. But we could sub in our own issues here, and the point would still be the same.
I know this is kind of odd, but you raised a bit of a golf analogy for me. I don't know how many golfers we have in here, but in an ideal situation, when you tee off, and trust me, I do not do this very often as far as ideal situations, but when you tee off, there is almost an ideal place that you need to put the ball to be able to set up for your next shot. Preferably middle of the fairway, usually. I have played with some really great golfers, and I have yet to see anybody consistently hit it perfectly in the middle of the fairway. There's always a little bit of a... Now, does that mean that's wrong? Just because it's not dead in the middle? No. You do the best you can, and you move on from there. And that's what Keaton was talking about here. The Corinthians were kind of all over the place, which is more like my style of golf. When they should have been trying to at least try to get to the middle. Now, that doesn't mean we compromise ourselves. That doesn't mean we compromise in order to bring everybody together. You can't compromise obedience to get to unity. That won't work. But you have to be willing to study. All right, sorry. Got off on a golf analogy. I apologize. It says, stay as you are because of the present distress. We don't know exactly what the present distress is that he was talking about. It could be anything from persecution, which is probably the most likely thing around it. So it says, if you're married, stay married. If you're unmarried, stay unmarried. But you have not sinned if you don't get married. And vice versa, you haven't sinned if you get married. Basically, Paul's saying, you know, if I had my druthers, you probably shouldn't get married. Because there's a lot of external influences going on right now that it might not be a good thing. But if you will avoid sexual immorality, then you need to get married. So you have a situation here, Paul's preferences versus sin. Paul prefers that you don't get married. But if in the course of not getting married, it creates a temptation to sin, then you need to get married. And that's what Paul's saying. If you can avoid sin, do it. And it's just a matter of competing priorities. I want you to be without care. Those who are unmarried, who do they care about? It says the things of the Lord. Now, does that mean that people who are married don't care about the things of the Lord? But because we're married, we also have, I don't want to say, I put competing priorities. I'm not sure it's competing priorities, but we have other priorities. We also have to please our spouse. Paul says, I would that you just focused on Jesus all the time. But if it'll keep you from sinning, you need to get married. And marriage is a sanctified union. So you need to get married, but that will probably take you a little bit away from your focus on Jesus, because now you have to focus on your spouse a little bit. Thoughts that you have? Yes, sir.
Maybe this is a clarification. It's a given that you can only be remarried if it's a scriptural divorce.
That's correct.
Unscriptural divorce. So I guess what constitutes an unscriptural divorce?
What constitutes an unscriptural divorce? Wait a minute, we're about to get there, but I'll answer that right now. Just about anything other than adultery. Okay? So now, let me be clear. Divorce is not prohibited. What's prohibited is remarriage. Yeah. So, now, remember, marriage is a sanctified institution. Divorce is not prohibited, but if God had wanted us to be divorced, I'm not sure he would have invented marriage, right? So there is not, in my mind, and I had a Bible teacher at one point that told it this way: you're allowed to divorce because of adultery, but you need to think pretty hard about that. Marriage is a sanctified institution. It was put in place by God. You need to examine your own heart, even in the situation of adultery. Adultery is not a ticket to divorce. It's a justification. But if you're looking, now, we go back to our discussions earlier about do not deprive one another. What happens when you deprive one another? Start looking elsewhere. When you start looking elsewhere, then you got, caught ya. You're done. We're divorced. See, I don't think that's right either. You got scriptural grounds, but I'm not sure you've got scriptural grounds. Thoughts that you have? Good question. Thank you very much. That kind of gets into the crux of kind of where we're going next. Yes?
Well, two things. I mean, the way I always heard it and the way divorce is the nuclear option. It obliterates everything on each side, right? And so to your point, there are reasons and there are situations where it's allowed and necessary. It's still the tough road to hoe. And that's why I think, when I marry somebody, we talk at length ahead of time. It's easy to get married. It is real hard to stay married. And then there are consequences that come from that. But again, there's provisions for that. But going back to the comment before, Paul, all of this, and you made the good point, this is Paul's perspective. And this is where we have to remember the Bible reconciles to itself. Paul has a really unique perspective, and I think partly it comes from his background persecuting Christians, that he wanted laser focus to spread the gospel. And so for him, being single made that an easier priority. But if we just read that alone, we might get the idea that marriage isn't a good thing, or that it's, but in almost every other context, God created marriage, God blessed marriage, encouraged marriage. In almost every other facet, and that doesn't mean Paul's perspective is wrong, because they really can coincide. He's just saying it's easier, right? And it is, but that doesn't mean the other is wrong or any less. It's just a different path.
And Paul states that. He basically says, this is me talking, this is not God, but if it's up to me, you ought to stay single. If you can't stay single because of sexual immorality, then you need to get married. But in an ideal world, you'll stay single because we've got some trials coming up. And it's going to make it harder to be married. A wife is bound by law as long as her husband lives, may only remarry only if the husband dies and only in the Lord. I think we tend to miss that one, only in the Lord. So if there is a legitimate divorce, let's say a legitimate divorce, let's say it's just over. Let's say there's been adultery committed, and we've tried to work through it and tried to work through it and tried to work through it, and we've not been able to. There's a divorce. That remarriage with the aggrieved party should only be in the Lord. I'm going to take that a step further. If you're a member of the church and you're looking to get married, you ought to be looking only in the Lord. Because remember what we talked about earlier? It's kind of probably 50-50. On the one hand, there's an opportunity to bring your spouse to Christ and the truth, but on the other hand, there's just as much opportunity for them to drag you away. Don't take that chance. Only in the Lord. Thoughts that you have. We have about 2 minutes.
Mark, I take on your last comment there and say a little bit wrong. There's more chance that they will take you away because it requires energy. You have to input work to stay, but you don't really have to do much to drift away.
That's exactly right. It's a gradual thing even. It's one of those things, well, I'll stay home with the spouse today. Or, you know, they're sleeping in, that bed sure looks good, you know. It doesn't take a whole lot. You know, Satan's very adept at what he does. He's been doing it a long time. And I got to tell you, an unbelieving spouse will just make it that much more difficult. Satan will use them every chance he gets. Every chance he gets. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, thank you so much. My concern is like, if you want to say because of adultery, we don't want to divorce, but in marriages that we've seen today, it's like violence is the order of the day. I mean violence, physical abuse, emotional abuse. And if you want to, because of adultery, I mean, yeah, I want to base divorce just on adultery. We want to endure marriage because of violence and all that. I mean, I think many marriages are falling apart because of all that. Aside from adultery.
And again, remember, divorce is allowed, I don't want to say for any reason, but there's a myriad of reasons a divorce can be allowed. Violence in a marriage, I absolutely agree. There ought to be a divorce. There needs to be a separation right there, okay? The deal is neither party is allowed to remarry after that. The only reason they can remarry is if they divorced because of matters of adultery. Does that make sense? Okay. Divorce in an abusive situation, for instance, probably not only advisable but necessary, but neither party is allowed to remarry.
Mark?
Yes, sir?
I take some exception to that. So Jesus says in Matthew 19:6, it says, consequently, they are no longer two, but one flesh, referring to Genesis chapter 2. What therefore God has separated together, let no man separate. It is a covenant relationship, and God gave us that in Genesis chapter 2, looking forward to the covenant relationship between Christ and the church, Ephesians 5. And so we should not separate. It says it very clearly.
Well, all right. All right, I'm 1 minute over. Thank you very much.